Yuyan, Caxian District, the People's Republic of China, 2014. Yuyan was 10 years old. She lived in a small fishing village along a tributary of the Yangtze River in the Caxian District. Life was uneventful and straightforward. In the morning, she would go to the shore and help her father pull his nets out of the river. Usually, they would not catch much, but it was enough to feed the family along with a bowl of rice. She would then spend the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon in school. It was not anything fancy, certainly not like the education she would have received if she lived in a big city. But she learned enough to get by, to read, write, do math, and science. She dreamed big, as she wanted to travel overseas and attend a college in Japan, South Korea, or even the United States. She did not know what she wanted to do. Her opinion on topics changed from week to week. Today, she thought she might be an oceanographer. She had just watched an old video of Jacques Cousteau and thought traveling to the deepest depths of the ocean would be amazing. Her mind was filled with all the beautiful discoveries she would find, from lost cities to pirate gold and sea monsters. After school, she spent some time playing with her friends before returning to the shore to help her father put his nets back in the water before returning home for dinner. She would go to sleep and lay awake for a few more hours, staring up at the stars, dreaming of other places and wonders she'd never imagined. Tomorrow, she thought she might want to be an astronaut, as the full moon was stunning right now. With each day that passed, however, life became more challenging. The government was building a massive dam called the Three Gorges. It was said to be the 8th wonder of the world, which meant nothing to you. What she did know was its construction was making the river polluted. Each morning she headed to the banks to help her father. Fewer and fewer fish were being caught. Those that were, many of them were already dead or sick. The same was happening to every other fisherman in the village. Then, a government representative in a slick black suit showed up one afternoon and told everyone how important the dam was. China was stepping out of the shadows and becoming one of the greatest powers of the world. This also meant nothing to you, as she hardly understood his fancy words. And it also meant nothing to the adults. The man left, but with a demand that everyone in the village had to go. He threatened that the entire valley would be under 1,000 feet of water in a few months. She remembered how angry her father and the rest of the townspeople were as they ran the government man out. Progress, nevertheless, continued. Less fish was caught, that it seemed pointless even bothering to check the nets. Soon, her father gave up altogether. More and more families also began leaving the village. That meant many of Yu's closest friends and schoolmates were gone. There was not much for her to do. Then, last month, it was decided that the school, too, would close. Yu still dreamed, but it was becoming less vivid, as her mind was no longer stimulated with knowledge of the outside world. Her home became less secure as her father and mother began to fight a lot, with her father often getting physical with Yu's mother. She wanted to leave, but Yu's father said this village was their home. It had been their home for 20 generations, but times were changing. Before long, more than half the people had gathered everything they owned and walked out of the valley. Yu now spent her days walking along the banks of the river, which was now ashen white. Garbage and other material washed ashore, clogging the narrowest parts of the flow, that the villagers had to build a barrier to keep the filth out. 2 days ago, another government man arrived and demanded that everyone leave. This man was assaulted and nearly killed. Yu had cried as she watched her father beat the man senseless. She felt that life could not get worse, despite her stomach constantly rumbling from the lack of food. That was until 2 weeks ago. Yu walked along the riverbanks, picking up trash and examining it, wishing the garbage still had food left in it. Rotting fish made the air smell horrible, and drinking the water even boiled. It gave Yu the runs. She tried to play with her friends as they would pick up random objects and use them as toys, which she was doing the afternoon the helicopters showed up. She was lucky enough to find a ball that washed ashore. It was mostly flat, but still had some bounce left in it. It was like finding gold for the children as they gathered around her and kicked the toy, laughing as they had done before the river killed the fish and made people sick. Then suddenly, she stopped playing as she turned her attention to the sky, as the air filled with the hum of helicopters. The helicopters then spread out and formed 2 long lines. Booms extended out from both sides of the choppers as they lined up to pass over the village. The villagers came rushing out of their homes and gathered in large groups, looking out as the helicopters approached. As they neared the village, a green mist was sprayed from the booms. Yu thought it smelled like rotten eggs, as the cloud fell to the earth and coated everything in a thin layer. When it touched her skin, it began to sting and turn red. She could not help herself from vomiting as the helicopters flew overhead. The whole village was sprayed with mist, with each of the people sharing the same sensation that you just experienced. They began to panic and cry out, with the children racing to their parents' arms. When the helicopters completed, they passed, they disappeared back around the mountain, but not before another chopper appeared. This time, as it passed over the village, it dropped little pieces of paper, which fluttered down and stuck to everything the mist had touched. You picked up the paper and read it. It said the mist was to help the river get well, and not to be alarmed. You knew something didn't feel right, however. After a couple of days, the village began to settle down. The people started to forget the incident and tried to get back to their lives. As gross as it was, some even believed the mist would help the river, as they eagerly waited for the fish to return. You still distrusted the notes, primarily when the first group began getting deathly sick 5 days later. The sickness spread quickly, as those worse off could not move from their beds. They coughed up blood, which drizzled from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouths. Blindness followed, then the rest of the senses before the body began to convulse. Yu's mother was among the first to die, after suffering horribly for a week. She remembered walking with her father as they buried her mother. She cried all day and all night as her father, already starting to feel sick, worsened. He locked himself in his room and would not allow you to see him. By this time, nearly every family had died or was close to death. You wandered the village. There were not enough people well now to bury the dead or do anything with the bodies. Even the animals, cats and dogs, pigs and birds, had all died. You stood over a dead dog, looking down at it. A strange orange growth had consumed the body and had rooted itself to the ground. One morning, as you started to feel sick, she slowly inched her way to her father's room and dared to slide back the door. The smell struck her like a bat across the face. She fought back the urge to vomit and opened the door completely. Her father laid on his bed, his body all twisted and mangled. Ugly growths had torn out of his body, rooted to the floor. She wanted to touch him and drag him out of the house, but knew it was better to do nothing. So she slid the door shut and let him be. The following morning, Yu was the last person in the village still alive. She felt delirious. She was wet all the time, as it felt like her body was melting from the inside out. Strange, painful growths burst through the skin on her arms and back, looking like coral as it dried. She wandered down to the river and grabbed her father's nets, pulling them out only to find no fish. Yu then made her way over to the schoolhouse and sat. She flipped through the magazine, an old copy of National Geographic, and marveled at the pictures and vivid colors. She managed a faint smile as she dreamed of her future and everything she wanted to do. Before closing her eyes, Yu thought she would become a photographer and take beautiful pictures so that other children could see beautiful places when she grew up. Yu heard voices outside the school. She sat at her desk, barely able to move, as the growths had rooted themselves to the table. However, she was alive, but her breathing was shallow, and only one eye could be opened. She saw a man in a funny yellow-looking rubber suit and a gun enter the school. He flashed his light across the room before settling on her. He must have seen she was still alive as he radioed for help. A moment later, half a dozen men in identical yellow suits came into the school and began poking at her. You tried to speak to them and tell them it hurts when they cut the roots that held her down on the desk, but she could not manage to say the words. She listened as the men talked to one another. Everyone was mostly talking to one individual who was the most important man in the group. She heard them call him General Lee. She did not understand most of what they were saying, as they used words she had never learned in school. They were amazed she was still alive, as they stated that everyone in the village was dead. But you knew they were not here to save her, as they hardly paid attention to her, but instead acted like she was a fish caught in their nets. When Yu had finally freed, she was laid on the ground before a strange plastic bed was brought into the school. Lights flickered from its panels. Before putting her on it, the men took blood from her arm, attached wires to her body, and stuck needles in her. She was then placed inside the plastic bed, where it was sealed shut. As she was wheeled outside, the sun blinded her. She began screaming, not out loud, but in her head. She would never see home again.